I lived in a town where most kids spent most of their time playing outside. Digital games or even the internet weren't a thing back then. Children run around and swim in the ponds, play tag or hide and seek until the sun sets. I wasn't exactly one of those lads who are confident enough to have a lot of friends, so my social life was a bit of a struggle at first. Our town had a relatively small community, where most people knew each other. I spent most of my days doing chores for other people in exchange for a few bucks, like cleaning their yard, fixing their fences, or fetching stuff from one house to another. By doing so, I got acquainted with other lads who did the same activities. We would even compete with each other sometimes, and enjoy our fruits of labor at the end of the day together. In one of our arguments about who would do what, we chose to make a decision like how we often did it, by drawing sticks. Usually, the one who would draw the shortest stick would have to deal with the most difficult task for the day, but during that time, the stakes were a bit different. The consequences of drawing the shortest stick wouldn't be the one to handle the hardest job, but he would need to lend a hand to someone that we're all scared of. You see, there was one house located far from the others in the woods, and we were told it was in need of someone to grab some groceries. It was actually a fairly easy job, but none of us wanted to go there. Her name was Mrs. Ellidore. The house was at least a 30-minute walk from where we were. Mrs. Ellidore used to own a clinic in the town, but she closed it down and never spoke to anyone after that. Ever since her retirement, rumors spread among the kids about the doctor. It was probably due to the kids' fear of doctors that started the rumors, or probably due to her appearance alone. She had always been a little weird, or so they said, but what scared us kids from her the most was how they described her appearance. It seemed as if she was a character straight out from a horror movie. They said that she shut herself out from the outside world for some reason. She was married to one of the townsmen who used to hunt together with the other folks, but there were rumors that she lost her sanity ever since he left her for another woman. Her skin became so pale and wrinkled, as it was rarely exposed to the sun. Her long face and deep-set eyes, combined with her white hair and husky voice, made her look more like a wicked witch instead of a retired doctor. One of my friend's father, who was a hunter and a butcher, would sometimes deliver her fresh catch upon her request, and it is also how we knew that she needed help. Mrs. Ellidore used to have a servant, but she left for some unknown reasons. We assume that she must be hard to deal with. Unluckily for me, I was the one who drew the shortest stick. I tried to make them accompany me and just split the tip afterwards, but Mrs. Ellidore strictly said that only one person should come to her house, and I knew it would just cause me a bunch of scolding and trouble if I didn't answer her request, so I was forced to go on my own. Mrs. Ellidore's house was quite big, too big for one person, in my opinion, but it was obvious that no man was there to maintain the property as it used to be. The wooden fence had seen better days, and the grass was overgrown. Even the stairs leading to the porch was creaking. As I knocked on the door, a shaky voice of an old lady ordered me to come in. It was the first time that I heard Mrs. Ellidore's voice in person, so my imagination ran wild as I was reminded of what I was about to see. Even though the sun hardly entered the closed windows, the inside of the house looked more normal than I had imagined. There were a bunch of pots and figurines displayed, and a bunch of medical books blocking the view from the entrance to the living room. She asked me to grab the money placed on the coffee table, along with a list of what I should buy. At the time, all I saw was her pale, skinny legs swaying back and forth on her rocking chair in the living room. It was a good thing I brought my bike because I was asked to buy quite a lot. When I got back, I just placed the groceries on the table while she was still at the spot where I first saw her, right on the coffee table. A plate of biscuits was prepared along with my payment. She paid me quite generously, so I thanked her cheerfully without approaching her. With her husky voice that sounded like she was running out of breath, she told me to grab the biscuits and asked me to return a week later. When I returned to our home, my friends were actually waiting for me to ask me how it went. However, they were disappointed when I told them that it was nothing out of the ordinary. They were probably expecting me to say that I freaked out when I saw her, or maybe I saw something strange in her house, but that wasn't the case at all. Even though she barely spoke and I didn't see her face yet, she was actually kind of sweet to prepare me some treats. As she requested, I returned a week later, like how it was the first time I was there. The list of groceries were prepared on the table. I went there much earlier than before, so I was able to return much earlier after buying her things from the market. This time, she prepared some soup and juice on the table, and like before, she paid me quite generously. I was treated nicely for the second time, and I was starting to think her image among the townsfolk were completely untrue. With that in mind, I decided to finally approach her and thank her properly. She was sitting at her rocking chair next to a window, looking outside with a blank stare. And indeed, she had deep-set eyes, a long face, and a pale, wrinkled skin. But it wasn't fear that I felt when I finally saw her. Mrs. Ellidore turned her head toward me as I slowly walked towards her. And what I saw was a sad old lady, alone in her life, pretending to be okay with a fake smile. Mrs. Ellidore was about 80 years old. She was already struggling to speak aloud, and she was already having some trouble breathing properly. It was obvious she needed someone to look after her, or at least do her chores for her. She asked me if I liked the soup, so I nodded to say yes. The gentle smile on her dry lips was contradicted by her miserable eyes. I asked if she would allow me to take care of her yard, since it was still early to get back home anyway. Besides, if she paid me 3 times as much compared to what I usually receive from the other neighbors with a much harder task? Well, she told me that I didn't have to do it, but I kept on insisting until she agreed. Her gardening tools were a bit rusty, but they were still able to do the job. I trimmed the grass and I did what I could to repair the fence. While doing so, she prepared me snacks once again, and even wrapped some that I could bring home with me. As she handed them to me, I saw some scars on her arms that looked like deep bite marks, but I decided not to ask about it. As I returned to our old neighborhood, I told the others what I did. I shared my impression towards Mrs. Ellidore. I simply told them that she must not be feared, and should be aided when requested without thinking twice. However, I didn't manage to convince anyone, so I still went back there alone a week later. It became a daily routine for me. I would drop by Mrs. Ellidore's house once every week and buy her groceries for her. I fixed what I could around the house and helped her with the other mundane chores that needed to be done. After a couple of months visiting, she began to open up to me somehow. It seemed that aside from her need for help around the house, she was also looking for someone to talk to. However, there were instances that I couldn't understand the way she was behaving. She would sometimes lock herself inside her room, and I could hear her crying, even if she denied it. I wanted to cheer her up somehow, to be some kind of company for this old lady, but I could still see that the sadness in her eyes whenever we talked, as if she was carrying a heavy burden that she couldn't share with anyone. Whenever I was there, she would always prepare a meal from breakfast to lunch, depending on how long I would stay for the day. However, I was wondering why she never prepared any meat dishes. There were always a bunch of fresh meat cuts that I picked up from the butcher for her among the groceries that I brought weekly, but I never saw her eat meat. There were questions that she refused to answer at times when I brought them up, including the empty picture frames. Why was she so alone? Where did she get those bite marks from on her arms? Or why she never went outside? She would just divert the discussion to other topics. So I just thought it would be rude of me to ask these questions again when she clearly didn't want to talk about them. Now, as time went by, I could notice that she was gradually getting weaker and weaker. A few more months had passed, and she was on the bed most of the day. And I started to visit her more and more often than how I usually did, and she was already struggling to walk around her big house, and so I began to prepare meals for her as well. I wanted to have someone with me during those times, especially those who could take care of weakened elderly compared to me. But even at that point, there was nobody willing to visit her but me. I would agree that there were times that Mrs. Ellidore snapped or broke down for some reason that she didn't want to tell, but it shouldn't have been enough of an excuse for anyone to forsake a helpless old lady who badly needed help. Whenever I stayed at her bedside, she would stare at me as if she wanted to tell me something. But she would then look away and remain quiet. She couldn't even wear that fake smile that she used to make. I decided not to ask her what it could be to avoid upsetting her. In her condition at the time, it would be dangerous if she would suddenly lash out again. They might have been right when they said that she was unstable, but to me, it seemed more of an emotional unstable rather than a psychological. I wasn't able to know if she had any family relatives that I could get in contact with. I wasn't able to persuade anyone to join me to look after her. The local pastor wasn't around at the time. But even if someone among the townsfolk would come, I actually doubt if she would like that. All she had was me by her side. She did what she could to gasp for air. She asked me to come closer so that she could whisper in my ear. As she was about to cast her last breath, she told me something that would finally answer the questions that bothered me for quite a long time. The sorrow on her face remained even after her death, for she was burdened with an act that she deeply regretted. I climbed down the cellar, just as she told me to. Now, she never asked me to go down there when she was alive, so I thought there was nothing down there. As I was in the cellar, I saw piles of huge dirty bowls that seemed to belong to a huge animal, but Mrs. Ellidore didn't have a pet. There was a freezer and a portable stove set up on the side, and in the freezer, there was a stock of meat that I bought for her regularly. Even at times when she was already very weak, I knew that she was down there because of all the used kitchen utensils. On top of the freezer was a note addressed to me, and it contained her confession that utterly terrified me. As I was still mourning for her, I also felt a sudden urge of fear as I read an act of brutality and inhumanity. It took a while before I finally calmed down and tried to figure out how to approach the situation. I thawed a slab of meat and brought out a glass of milk, for I was about to feed the secret that Mrs. Ellidore had kept for years. A lamp was hanging on the wall, The scratches on the metal hook showed that the lamp was taken and returned at the same place on a regular basis. Below the shelf was a trap door that led to the lower ground of the cellar, so I climbed down just as she instructed me to. The room below the cellar was very dark, with a stench of rotting meat and excrement. As I stepped forward and held up the lamp, a large cage was revealed to me. I slid the bowls of meat and milk in the opening below it. And what, or rather, who, was being contained by these steel bars finally crawled their way out of the dark to feed. It was grinding its teeth as it looked at me suspiciously, then growled like a rabid beast as it took the food. I was frightened yet saddened at the same time, because this animal was not an animal at all, but a human that was turned into one. His lips were shaved off, and his mouth was slit open from cheek to cheek. His feet were both amputated so he couldn't run away. His tongue was cut and his vocal cords were severed so he couldn't be able to yell for help, nor plead for mercy. Both his hands were cut in between, and all that was left were his pinky and thumbs. This old man that was inhumanly defiled was no other than Mr. Ellidore himself. Mrs. Ellidore caught her unfaithful husband in the act when he was with another woman. She saw him lying with her right on their own bed in their own home. Due to her rage, she shot them both right there and then, using her husband's gun. The lady was killed, but she was able to save him. However, Mrs. Ellidore did not save him so that he could continue with his life, but to make him suffer for what he did. As she was succumbed by unsurmountable hate, she made her husband look like how she saw him at that moment. An animal. She operated on him and modified his appearance, and she removed his feet completely. But his suffering did not end there. She locked him in a cage and was starved to a point where he wouldn't eat anything. Like a common carnivore, he was forced to eat his food raw. The first raw meat he ate was not a slab of beef nor pork, but a minced meat that was beaten beyond recognition. Right after he satisfied his hunger, Mrs. Ellidore revealed that the meat he ate was no other than the lady that he had slept with. And shortly after that, he snapped and lost his sanity. After being treated like a wild animal for years, he gradually became one. When Mrs. Ellidore finally got back to her senses and regretted what she did, she tried to get him back to normal, but it was too late. He no longer accepted proper meals. Whenever she would try to hold him, he would viciously attack and bite her. She could no longer get him back, but she couldn't set him free as well. Despite this inhuman behavior, I sensed that there was still a bit of sanity left in him. When I told Mr. Ellidore that his wife had passed away, I saw that he paused for a very brief moment as he was munching his raw meat. I left the keys where he could reach it, and I walked out of the house. I was deciding how to deal with the situation when I suddenly smelled the smoke coming from the inside. And all of a sudden, a huge explosion came from the cellar and set the entire house on fire. I wanted to go back in and carry Mrs. Ellidore's body out, but it was already too late, and there was nothing that I could do. I rushed back to the others so that I could tell them about the fire. But when help arrived, the house was already completely incinerated. And perhaps this was how she wanted to go. They were able to retrieve the bones of Mrs. Ellidore and gave her a proper burial. The floor of the cellar crashed in, and they failed to see anybody else. They say that the fire was caused by a gas leak triggered by an open lamp. I decided to keep the secret to myself, since there was no one else who knew the truth but me.